Welcome to Canvas New Quizzes. By the end of this virtual workshop, you should be able to identify the differences between classic quizzes and new quizzes, create new quizzes, moderate new quizzes, and convert classic quizzes to new quizzes. My name is Audrey Brickley, and I'm an instructional technology consultant in ITS Learning Technology, and you can reach me via Sixtech. But before I demonstrate the new quizzes in Canvas, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about what's happening. So what are new quizzes? Why do you need to know about them? Why does this matter? Why should you spend time on this workshop? So new quizzes are basically the new quiz engine in Canvas. And the idea is that this will eventually replace classic quizzes, the quizzes that we're used to using in Canvas. And so rather than making changes or updates to classic quizzes, Canvas has built a new quiz engine from the ground up, and it does include some new question types, a few new settings, a few new student features, and a really useful accommodation feature. And it definitely has an updated look and feel, and I'll show you that in a minute and you'll immediately know what I'm talking about. But they've also moved some things around, including settings and how you access SpeedGrader, at least for now, and that definitely takes some getting used to, as well as changes to how points work and how question groups and banks work. And we're just going to really go over these primary differences today, give the big picture, help you get started on using new quizzes, because I don't want to overwhelm you with all of the details, but Canvas is maintaining a Google Doc that shows every detail of the differences, and it is 6 pages long. So obviously I'm not going to go through it all. It's a lot. It would be boring, and the majority of it probably isn't relevant to you. But I will show you how to access this so that if you have like a really specific question about a feature that's really important to you or something like that, you can reference this doc. Or we can look at it together or talk about it together. So I know that the goal was basically to achieve feature parity with classic quizzes, meaning that what you were used to being able to do with quizzes can still be done in the majority of cases with new quizzes. So what about classic quizzes? What's the timeline? So this is really the big why of this workshop. And, new quizzes are eventually going to replace classic quizzes. And so I have the latest timeline from Instructure here. This is subject to change, but now we're getting closer, and you can see what's going to happen is that they are sunsetting classic quizzes. And I've put some arrows next to the relevant dates. So it's not that your classic quizzes are suddenly going to disappear, but starting next summer in July 2022, you won't be able to create any new quizzes using the classic quiz engine. So at that point, any new quiz you create will have to be made using the new quizzes engine. And then a few months later, in March 2023, students will no longer be able to take classic quizzes. And so here at UNCG, we just recently turned on new quizzes. It's kind of like a soft rollout. It's just opt-in for now. So they're available for you to use and build quizzes and start migrating your old quizzes, but you don't have to start using it now, but I would definitely recommend and think that you would want to, because this is your opportunity to get ahead of the curve. So you'll be able to get everything transitioned and learn how to use it now before you have to, and more importantly, before Canvas stops supporting classic quizzes. So once classic quizzes reaches the kind of end of life, it's not that your quizzes are going to disappear, but if you run into any issues, you're kind of out of luck because they're going to stop supporting classic quizzes at that point. So being proactive here is key. And right now you're in a great position to do that. And so what I would highly recommend before you even start thinking about converting your current quizzes is to just play around with it, like create a new quiz that you don't ever plan to use with students, just to get comfortable with it and develop that, kind of muscle memory with how new quizzes works. Because once you're working on an actual quiz, you kind of lose your sense of humor about it. So just practice and play like I'm going to do in my demonstration right now. Okay, so for the first part of the demonstration, I'm actually going to show you a new quiz from the student perspective. So I'm going to hop into student view, and I always think that this is a really helpful way when we're thinking about using a new tool or learning how to use a new tool to start from the student perspective, I think that really helps us conceptualize it and also word our instructions carefully and correctly and all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and click carbohydrates, the name of my quiz, and you will immediately see it does look very different. So we have the title at the top, instructions, the time limit, all this relevant information for students, and then a button to begin. And you'll notice right away that there is a clock at the top. So previously in classic quizzes, we kind of had that clock that kind of sat at the top of the page off to the side. Sometimes students didn't notice it. And this really keeps it right here at the top in the center, and we can hide it if it stresses us out. And another new feature I want to draw your attention to are these thumbtacks here, or pins. And what students can do is pin questions. So let's say they're not sure about this answer and they want to come back to it. They can pin it, and then Canvas will remind them if they try to submit their quiz while they still have pinned questions to go back and look at those again. So I did set up two kind of basic questions first, so you could just start to wrap your head around all the differences here with new quizzes. We have a multiple choice and then a multiple answer. And then when you get down here, you'll see that we have one of our first new question types, and this is called hotspot. And what this allows you to do as the instructor is upload an image and then designate an area on that image where students will click to get the correct answer. So in this example, I did identify the sugar molecule, and it happens to be this one. So I'm going to click inside this area, and that's my answer for this question. Something to consider with hotspot question types is they're not fully accessible, meaning they're not going to work for all students. So students who can't use a mouse, for example, or students with visual impairments. So if this is something that I think you think will work really well in your courses for the vast majority of your students, you just want to think ahead and prepare an alternative quiz for students who are not able to use this question type. Okay, moving on to the next one, we have the categorization question type. This is also new to new quizzes. What you can do is establish categories and then give possible answers, and students will click and drag those answers to the correct category. So although this typically you would think a drag and drop activity like this would also not be accessible, because as you can see, I'm using my mouse to move these items around. Actually, Canvas has thought of that, and they have, I'm just going to go ahead and use my keyboard to complete this activity. So you can see that I can actually select it with my keyboard and decide which category I want to place that item. So this and the following new question type, which are drag and drops, are actually still accessible, which is wonderful. But I did want to point out that this is an incorrect answer. This is just a distractor. So if students put this answer in either one of these, that's incorrect. And something else to consider is that there is no partial credit right now. So if I did perchance move this one into that, I get no points. I do not get any of the 10 points for this quiz question. And so that's something you want to consider if you're going to use these. Another new question type, it's called the ordering question type. And this just allows me to have students put things in the correct order. So I'm going to go ahead and move these around until I think they're in the correct order. And that's it. That's how I answered that question type. And finally, we have what they're calling stimulus content and attached questions. So this gives you an opportunity to add content, pictures, videos, diagrams, anything you can normally add with the rich content editor, you can add on the left here, and then attach associated questions to this stimulus content on the right. And you can see if I scroll down a little bit, there's the next question. This question is not associated with this stimulus content. Any questions that are will be given a scroll bar over here. And students will review that content. So you could include a passage or anything you want to give them. You can actually set this up not just as a quiz, assessment, but an interactive lesson where you're maybe doing a mini lecture that you recorded and then some associated content and then another chunked part of that lecture and some more associated questions, and then, maybe an article that you want them to read, and so on and so forth. And so you'll just go through here and answer these questions. And that's it. That's what New Quizzes looks like from the student's perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and submit my quiz. And it's telling me that it is auto-grading the questions that it can, because as you know, Canvas can't grade our essay questions for us. We have to go back into SpeedGrader and do those, so it does alert the student to that. I did want to point out this percentage because this is going to become important from the instructor side. It tells the student it got a certain percent right, and it also tells them how many points they earned, because how points work has changed with Canvas New Quizzes. And I just wanted to quickly show you, if you do need to grade essay questions, you'll notice that there's no way to access SpeedGrader like we're used to in quizzes, and you actually have to go to the gradebook to get to SpeedGrader. So you will look for the name of the quiz in your gradebook, click the three-dot menu, and then access SpeedGrader that way. And then it tells me that question 8 needs to be graded, so I can scroll down and find it. And it has this great feature where I can just give the student full credit or no credit. And that's it. Okay, so for this next part of the workshop, what we're going to do is kind of go back in time and see how I set up that new quiz from the instructor perspective and kind of walk through the new features and differences with new quizzes. So when you go to add a new quiz to your course, if you just click the quiz button, it's going to probably bring you just to the classic quiz engine that we're used to. In order to make Canvas new quizzes available in your course, you probably have to go to settings to enable it, depending on when you're watching this tutorial. So at this time, it's a feature preview. And so if you don't see the option to add a new quiz, you're gonna have to come to settings, feature previews, look for new quizzes, and enable that in your course. And now when we go back to quizzes, we will be given the option to choose our quiz engine for how we want to set up our new quiz that we're creating. But before I do that, I did mention that long doc that Canvas has prepared that demonstrates every difference, or lists every difference between the two quiz engines, and you can access that right here from this page. So I'm just going to show you. It brings you to the Canvas community. And then from here, you'll get this link to view the comparison document. And here's where you can come to kind of examine the very granular differences between the two quiz engines. And like I said, I'm not going to go through them all. It's probably most of it is not really relevant to you, but just so you know that it's there. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new quiz with the new quiz engine, and you're going to notice right away that it looks different. I don't have that big box to add my quiz instructions. That's moved, and a lot of the quiz settings also have moved. So the only options we have here are these settings and the assign to box, where we can add our due dates and our availability dates. We don't want to change the submission type. We're going to have to leave that alone. But the biggest difference here that I want to point out is points, because we're used to seeing this for assignments and graded discussions, but this is new in new quizzes, that we set the number of points on the quiz settings. In classic quizzes, we gave each question a point value, and then that added up to how many points the quiz would be worth. So if we had 2 quiz questions worth 50 points each, that quiz would be worth 100 points. Well, now Canvas is asking you to tell us how many points is this quiz worth, and then the math of the point value of the questions that the student gets right is irrelevant to how many points they earn toward their grade in your course, if that makes sense. So if you make your quiz worth 100 points, but your quiz questions only add up to 50 points, Canvas is going to do the math of the percentage that the student earned So let's say they earned 100% of those 50 points in the quiz questions, they're going to earn all 100 points for the quiz, if that makes sense. And so that's really important to wrap your head around for new quizzes. You're going to want to go ahead and give it a name. And then this is where we used to see the questions tab at the top for classic quizzes. We have to actually go into the build area of new quizzes in order to start creating our questions and access the rest of the settings and reports and all of that. But I'm going to go ahead and click save first, just because that makes me comfortable. But when you go into the build area, the great thing about new quizzes is that everything in here saves automatically. So if you're like me with classic quizzes, you probably lost your questions a few times because you had to click update question, then you had to save that, and then you had to save your quiz. Well, now once you save that quiz from just those initial settings, every time you come into the build area, there's no save button. So I can work in here all day. And everything I do is going to automatically save. There's nothing else I have to do in terms of saving. So I think Canvas probably got a lot of feedback about people being frustrated with losing their quiz questions that they took so much time to set up, and they've eliminated that problem with new quizzes. So here's where, when we come into the build area, and I'm calling it the build area because you can see it's almost like a different interface within Canvas. It looks very different from the rest of Canvas. And when you click return, it just bumps you back out into Canvas, basically. So that's why I'm kind of calling it the build area. So when I go in there, it brings me into the like new quizzes area. And this is where I can start adding, this is where I added my title, but I can still edit that if I want to. I can add instructions here for students. And then here is where I'm going to get the button to start adding questions. So I click that and I get all of the question types, and I'm going to select which question type I want to add. And I'm just going to do that repeatedly until I have all the questions that I want in the quiz. I'm going to show you how to add, how to create the new categorization and hotspot and ordering questions and a few other features, but I'm actually going to save that until last because some of you may not be interested in those details. So I'm going to come back to that part at the end of the workshop. But for now, let's talk about the rest of the quiz settings that we're used to seeing, and there are some new features in here. So this is where we go to access the rest of the quiz settings in this build area. We can now shuffle questions for the entire quiz. We used to have to use question groups to shuffle our questions in classic quizzes. Question groups are kind of gone from new quizzes, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about item banks, which have kind of replaced the concept of question groups. So here's where we can shuffle those questions. We can shuffle the answers globally on the entire quiz. We may not want to do that. We can set that individually on the different questions. We can tell Canvas if we want to give one question at a time and allow backtracking. And I would definitely recommend leaving this on, because if we disable this for students, they answer a question, they move on to the next question, they can't go back to that first question. And I think that really goes against what most students are taught for test taking strategies. They're really taught to kind of answer the questions they know for sure first, then go back to the more challenging questions. So sometimes this can be a yucky surprise for students if they get to the end and realize they can't go back and do those hard questions that they skipped. We can require an access code. For example, if we're using the proctoring lab, we can enable a time limit. We can filter IP addresses. This is not something that we're using right now at UNCG. Also, that would be an option for like requiring students to take the quiz in a certain physical location, such as the proctoring lab. We can allow a calculator globally on the entire quiz, either a basic or scientific, and I'm going to leave that on so I can show you what it looks like. We can allow multiple attempts, and the new feature here is this waiting period. So I can give students, let's say, 2 attempts on the quiz, and then require a waiting period of like 2 days before they can do their next attempt to kind of encourage them to take time to study again before they retake the quiz instead of just keep, just trying to remember what they answered correctly and all of that stuff that they do. We can also restrict student result view, and it gives you a lot of self-explanatory options here for that. And the next thing I want to show you is this. Well, let's take a quick look at reports. This is where we come to access the reports we used to get on that main page of the quiz in Classic Quizzes, and then Moderate, because there's a great new feature here. I'm going to switch to my admin course because I have an enrolled student in this course, because you need to have someone enrolled in order to see this. So let's go to the build area and go to Moderate. And you can see I enrolled myself in this course. And this is where you can see this new option, which is called accommodations. We're used to being able to moderate a quiz for an individual student on an individual quiz. We might want to give them additional attempts or a time adjustment. But what we can do now with new quizzes is give an accommodation. And what this does is it applies this change to all quizzes across the entire course. So this is where we might moderate a one-off. So this student maybe had, some kind of situation that they came to you about, and you're like, okay, I'll give you another attempt because whatever happened and you weren't in the right headspace for taking the quiz that day. And so I'm going to give you one additional attempt on this quiz. And that would be a one-time thing. Or if I want to reopen the quiz because the student missed it or whatever. But here for accommodations, this tells me these settings will be applied to all course assessments for this student. So I can go ahead and, give the student additional time or give them time and a half on all quizzes across every new quiz in the entire semester. This will save you a lot of work. It's definitely a new efficiency feature. So you don't have to go into every quiz in your course and moderate the quiz for each student who has an accommodation. Okay, so let's go back to that build area. And something else I want to point out over here on this quiz that I've already built is this quiz navigator on the side. So if you recall, Classic Quizzes didn't give you numbers to your questions, which made it kind of frustrating when you were adding a lot of questions. If you wanted to know how many questions you had to actually go back and count them. Now it not only numbers them, but it gives you this navigator on the side, which is really cool. So if I open this up, I can kind of see each and every one of my questions. I can reorder them if I want to. I can see what kind of questions I have here. And I can navigate to those questions. So if I just want to jump down to number 8, it'll just jump down from this navigator section on the left. And now let's go back to my quiz that I'm building from scratch and start adding some. Actually, before I do that, let's talk about item banks because this is something new. It's called item banks because of that stimulus content. It's not just questions that you can add here. You can also add the stimulus content. So it's not called a question bank anymore. It's called an item bank. And this is kind of replacing question banks from Classic Quizzes as well as question groups. So right now, if we want to add, say, a group, what we'd call a question group in Classic Quizzes of 50 questions, and we want to have Canvas pull 10 of those 50 questions for each student, we're just going to add the bank there. And what we can do is select that bank. This, like, I can navigate to all my banks here. This tells me I have all these questions in my Chapter 1 bank. And from this Add Question button, I'll be able to find this little piggy bank icon. And when I click that, I can add the questions there. And here's where if I click Edit, I can tell like there's 7 questions in this bank, and I want it to only use, say, 3 of those 7 questions in this quiz. I can adjust the number of points, and now it's going to pull in those 3 questions from that bank here. Now let's say, oh, and the other thing important about item banks right now for new quizzes, there's no direct way to import your classic quiz banks into new quiz item banks. That is not a feature at this time. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to address that. If you're ready to start migrating your quizzes, what you'll have to do is take your question banks, add them to a quiz, so add every one of those 50 questions to a classic quiz, import those questions, that quiz, into new quizzes, and then add each one of those questions into a bank. So I'm going to show you how to add items to a bank right now, and to do that I will set up just a very simple like true and false question. So I'm going to give it a name, and I will add the stem. And that is definitely true, and you can find that knowledge base of articles at sixtech.uncg.edu. So I'm going to leave that marked as true. And now here's where I can add this question to a bank. I'm going to go ahead and add that to one of my existing item banks, or I can create a new item bank there. So if I created it, and it indicates there that these are questions from banks, if I wanted again to add my classic quiz banks to new quizzes at this time, you're going to have to do it this way. So adding all the questions to a quiz in classic quizzes, migrating that quiz into new quizzes, and then going through to each question and adding it to a bank in new quizzes. And that's really frustrating. That is not an option at this time. We're hopeful that it will be addressed. But if you feel anxious to start using Canvas new quizzes and you want to start getting these set up before you have to make that transition to new quizzes, this is the way you're going to have to do it. So why don't I go ahead and leave this build area, return to my course, and show you how you can migrate a classic quiz. So these are all classic quizzes. And I'm just going to go to my quiz page, and I'm going to select the three-dot menu. And once I add new quizzes to my course or enable it in the settings, this migrate option will be available. So you can just click migrate. It'll make a copy of the quiz in new quizzes. It will not be published. So even though this quiz is published at this time for students, I can make a copy of that quiz or migrate it into new quizzes. It'll just add a copy of this quiz. And it will not be published. So I can start working on converting that quiz. And I'm just not going to do it right now because it takes a few minutes. But you can tell if you're like working on gradually migrating your classic quizzes into new quizzes, you can just look for the icon. So the solid icon are new quizzes. The hollow icon are classic quizzes. So all of these are classic quizzes. This is a new quiz. That's just kind of a quick visual indicator for you on your quiz page if you're trying to keep track of where you're at with migrating your quizzes. And one final note about migrating classic quizzes to new quizzes. When you do that, you just want to make sure to look at everything, maybe take it in student view to make sure that everything converted correctly before you start using that with your students. Okay, so before I go back and show you how to build those new question types, I just want to include a few more notes of things to be aware of. The first one being that Lockdown Browser does not work well with new quizzes at this time. Respondus is promising that it does. I'm seeing issues when I use it. When I research the issue, I see lots of people are having issues. So if Lockdown Browser is important to you, don't start using new quizzes with your students until we know that Lockdown Browser is working well with new quizzes. A couple other changes, there's no survey feature now within new quizzes. Quizzes are quizzes in new quizzes. There's no survey, there's no practice quiz. It's just a quiz, and you'd control, like if you wanted it to just be simply a practice quiz, you could do 0 points. And if you wanted to do a survey with your students, Canvas is not recommending a specific alternative now that there's no official survey choice in the quiz engine, but they're just suggesting maybe you use something else. So here at UNCG, that might be a Google form that you link to in your Canvas course to survey your students. All right, let's get in there and start learning how to build the exciting new question types. If you're not interested in learning how to build those at this time, you can stop watching. You've already gotten all the relevant information about using new quizzes versus classic quizzes. Okay, so I'm just going to click the Add Question button here, and let's try categorization first. And I'm going to put my question title in and my question stem. And now it really is very intuitive. So I have my two categories here that students are going to add their answers to. My first one for this question, identify the simple and complex carbohydrates from the list, are going to be simple carbohydrates. And my other category is going to be complex. And then I'm just going to start adding the correct answers below each one. And then I can also add distractors, and these are going to be answers that don't fit into any of the categories. Again, you might just wish to be, extra clear with students that there will be distractors. So this food does not have simple or complex carbohydrates. So that's my distractor for this question. Here's where I can add an on-screen calculator just for this question. So if you don't want students to be able to access a calculator for all of your questions, you can choose which, if any, calculator they use for this question. And then it prompts you to say, well, do you want students to have it for all of the questions or just this one? Do we need to prevent students from going back and using the calculator on other questions? So again, it's very intuitive. It's telling you what's going to happen as you move through these options, which is fantastic. Now I'm going to set the number of points for this question and then click done. And now I have that question set up. Okay, now let's do that one that's very similar, the ordering question type. So I'm going to add a new ordering question. I'm going to give it a title, and I'm going to add my stem text. And again, very intuitive. So the top label, the bottom label, you don't have to include these, but I think it makes it extra clear for students. So I did tell them in my question stem, in order from highest to lowest. I'm still going to add it here just to give them that visual as they're working on ordering the items in the list. But I don't have to do that if I don't want to. And then I'm going to tell it which things I want the students to order. And I'm putting it in the correct order now. And so this is how I tell Canvas what order they should be in. Canvas will automatically kind of shuffle them so they're not automatically in the correct order when students see the question. And I'm going to give it my points. And now let's do the hotspot. So I'm going to click New Hotspot Question. I'm going to give it a title. And then I'm going to give it the stem. And also, as I pointed out when we were doing the first part of the demonstration about how this isn't accessible, you don't have to remember that I said that because Canvas warns you right here. It's not accessible to users requiring keyboard access or screen readers, which is super helpful. And just remember, you want to set up an alternative in advance just in case the need arises. And I'm going to add my stem text, and then here's where I indicate the image that I want to use for students to click on to give their answer. So I'm going to browse to that image of molecules that I had. And now Canvas prompts me, draw the hotspots shape. So this is where we're indicating where students can click to get their answer marked correctly. So I can do a square around. This is the correct one right here. But you can see if I do the square, it's kind of hard to get it just right. Same with the oval, like I might get a little piece of the other molecule in there. So I can actually do like a freeform polygon, which works really well. I'm just going to click and just keep clicking around the area where I want students to be able to click to get this one right. And that's it. So if students click anywhere inside this area, they will get the answer correct. And there are just the same similar options showing the calculator if you want them to, item banking, add my points. And of course, just like in Classic quizzes, you can always add feedback for correct answer, incorrect answers, or general feedback. And this will appear in every quiz question. Finally, let's talk about that stimulus content. So I'm going to add stimulus, and it gives me the rich content editor here. So I'm going to just add a title, instructions, and here's where I will add that image that I want to use for students to analyze before they start answering the questions. And now I've added my picture. I can kind of edit it, but there's all kinds of content you can add here. This is the rich content editor, so you could add images, links, you name it, a paragraph that you type out for students to read. You could record a mini lecture using any of our great tools, and then kind of turn this into an interactive lesson where students are interacting and engaging, answering questions instead of just sitting and passively watching that lecture. So you could chunk that out and do several stimulus content areas with associated questions on the right. So now that I have that there, I'm just going to scroll down and show you the rest of the options. Source URL is just for your information. So if I want to remember where I got this image from, the King Arthur website or whatever, I can just keep a note to myself there in case something ever goes wrong. And students are not going to see it, so it's just completely optional. Item banking, you can add this stimulus content to a bank, and I'm going to click Add Stimulus. And now I can start attaching the relevant questions to this stimulus content. And I get the same question types that I can add anywhere else. And I'm not going to make you watch me add more questions, but that's just for your information. There are a few new features that I do want to point out, though. So there used to be matching in classic quizzes, but now it's just a little bit more intuitive. So you can see it's just a little bit easier to use. If you've ever tried to put together a matching question in classic quizzes, it was kind of cumbersome. And also in the essay questions, there's this new feature called grading notes. So if you have TAs helping you grade or something like that, you can kind of give them some guidance here. Students won't see it. And also, you can limit the word count. You can limit the number of words or show the word count so you're aware of how many words students are using if that's important to you. And really, that's it. That's Canvas new quizzes. If you want to start using them, but you're not sure how to get started, just feel free to reach out to your school's ITC, or of course, you can always reach me via 6Tech. I'm always happy to help.